Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Chop It Up Sports. Today, I'm your host, Carter Stedman, and college football is underway here. Finally, the 2024-25 season is underway, and we're going to get into it. We had a lot of stuff to talk about here from week 0. Most importantly, what went down across the pond in Dublin, Ireland, as Georgia Tech took down number 10 ranked Florida State. Let's just get right into it. I think this was kind of the main event of the weekend. Obviously, College Game Days there, covering the game in Ireland. Coming in, there's a lot of unknowns on both sides of the ball. When you look at Florida State, right, last year they go undefeated. They get snubbed out of the playoffs, basically primarily due to the injury of Jordan Travis. They make it to the Orange Bowl and get blown out by Georgia. So coming into this year, a lot of talent left for the draft. They bring in a lot of guys from the portal, but relatively unknown what to expect from this Florida State team, right? But DJU coming in from Oregon State, playing the quarterback position. I think a lot of people expected this to be a team that was going to pick up right where they left off, and obviously that was not the case. And I think we're going to get into it here in a second, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that this isn't even going to be close to the Florida State team that we saw last year. As for Georgia Tech, second full season under Brent Key, we know what their quarterback Haynes King is capable of, as last year he led the ACC in passing touchdowns, but he also led the conference in interceptions. So he was kind of balancing himself out there between the touchdown to turnover ratio there last season. But Georgia Tech, I felt like in this game did enough just to win it. I didn't feel like this was a team that looked exceedingly great by any means. I just felt like they did enough to win, and Florida State did enough to lose. So I think when you look at the game, just kind of being able to break it down, Florida State jumps out to a quick start, right? They look really dominant on the ground game on their first drive, and they had this three-headed monster that you could kind of see between Roydell Williams coming over from Bama, Lawrence Tuafili, who has been there. He was the reigning conference player of the year, or player of the game in the ACC championship last year. And then Jalen Lucas, who's kind of a hybrid returner, receiver, running back kind of model with lots of speed. He comes over from Indiana. So early on, I personally thought that this is going to be a pretty one-sided game. I just thought that Florida State was going to be able to kind of pound it down the throat of Georgia Tech, so to speak, and that DJU, there wasn't going to be a ton expected of him. He was going to be able to kind of be a game manager, get the ball out quickly, just find his receivers. And that just wasn't able to allow them to win the game, honestly. After that first drive, they stalled out. They did go for 2 after the first touchdown, and then they kicked 2 field goals beyond 50 yards to end the first half. But I'm really worried about this Florida State team, quite frankly. I think when you look at the way they played, they weren't able to take the top off the defense. And this is a Georgia Tech team that, maybe they can take a step up defensively this year. But last year they were ranked last in the ACC. And for a conference that isn't that dominant, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that's a scary sight. And so I do think that the Georgia Tech defense has improved this year, but not to the point where Florida State should be rushing for 98 yards and only throwing for 198. So that worries me a lot about this Florida State team. When you look at the game and you look at how DJU is playing, and they talked about this during the broadcast of the game, his lack of decision-making, he just tries to do too much a lot of the time. And so this game, obviously, first game, it's week 0. You're kind of just trying to play within your system, not get too risky. And I think that kind of hurt this Florida State team a little bit. Early on in the game, we see a lot of short route combos, screens, jet screens, and really just dependent on the run game a little too much. And I think once you look at that first drive, you're able to see that, okay, Florida State's going to look to be dominant, and then once they've established the run game, they're going to try to use DJU in the play action, get the ball out quick. And I just think when you have a quarterback that kind of is a placeholder, so to speak, it really limits what you can do offensively on the side of the ball. If you can't take the top off a defense, then it really doesn't matter how well you're going to be able to run the ball, because you're not going to be as productive as if you are if the defense is worried about a deep threat down the field, right? So that really worries me about this Florida State team. I understand they had some receivers out with injury issues, but still, you can't have 0 completions beyond 6 yards in the first half and expect to win a game or be dominant by any stretch of the imagination. So DJU, when you look at the box score, right, he's 19 of 27 for 193. That's not necessarily impressive. He didn't turn the ball over, but he didn't necessarily do anything to win the game either. So when you look at it, he takes care of the ball. He made relatively smart decisions, but he didn't make any necessarily winning plays. I know they had the 2 fourth down conversions on the last drive of the game to tie it up, but early on throughout the first 3 quarters, there was nothing really that stood out to me that said, okay, this is going to be an offense that is going to be a problem for teams to come later on in the season. So I am worried about this Florida State offense. I think their running game is productive. I think they have a variety of ways that they can run the ball, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the quarterback position, right? And that is the most important position probably in all of football. And if you can't have a quarterback who's productive enough to push the ball downfield, then you're not going to win very many games. I understand this is a Florida State team that a lot of people have in the playoff predictions. A lot of people have them projected to win the ACC. I personally don't. We'll get into that here later on in the episode. But I just think that this is a really bad look to start the season, and especially for a team that had so much hype coming off of last year. They go undefeated. They have some guys come back on the offensive side of the ball specifically. And to just have such a dismal performance like that really worries me against a Georgia Tech team that wasn't dominant, but they did do some things that was able to help them win the game. I think what stood out the most to me was how they used their quarterbacks in the run game. With Haynes King, obviously we know he's a dual threat quarterback. He was able to push the ball down the field later on in the second half, but honestly between him and DJU, two mediocre performances in terms of passing, I thought. But Zach Pyron, they bring in the backup. He opens up the game with a touchdown for Georgia Tech with a little QB draw. And then Jamal Haynes, the running back. Let me tell you, this guy is a stud. He went for 11 carries for 75 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, I know it doesn't seem like a lot on paper, right? But for those of you that were watching the game, by the end of it, he was picking up 4 to 5 yards per carry on a Florida State defensive line that was really just worn down, right? And going into this game, we talked about how this Florida State line was going to be able to kind of refill those holes that they lost last year to the draft, just because of how dominant that defensive line looked last year. That was not the case today. And I just think what really made the difference was how creative Georgia Tech was with their play call. They had inside zones, outside zones. They're running jet sweeps to the left, jet sweeps to the right, and then they have their quarterbacks, more specifically Haynes King, but then when you have a backup who brings in a different look as well, it really just allowed them to mix up their running game a lot, and that just threw Florida State off completely. They weren't able to stop the run at all, and Georgia Tech finishes the game with just shy of 200 yards, which, like I said, it wasn't amazing, but it got the job done in a sense where Florida State just wasn't able to predict what was going to happen, even at the end of the game, where they're in those situations where you know they're going to run it, they're setting up to kick this game-winning field goal. They're still getting 3 to 4 yards per carry, which ideally is not what you want as a defense, especially a defense that expects a lot out of their front 3, 4, 5 guys. So this game was really something that, I mean, a lot of hype around. It's the first game of the season, but in terms of like gameplay, I felt like it was relatively mediocre. Georgia Tech is a team that has a lot of question marks. I've already kind of talked about that. But I think they just did enough to win the game, right? They didn't turn the ball over. They did have a couple scares, but they executed when they needed to. Florida State goes on a 15-play, 8-minute drive in the middle of the fourth quarter, and they get 2 fourth down conversions that are down in distance, right? We're talking 4th and 8, 4th and 10. They execute on both of those, and they put it in the end zone. So for a minute there, the momentum shifted with about 6 minutes to go. So at that point, you're asking yourself, okay, is Georgia Tech going to feel the pressure? Or are they going to be able to run the clock out, get in field goal range, execute a nice 5 to 6 minute drive, and put themselves in a position to win? And ultimately, they did do that. And when you look at that drive, they weren't really airing it out. They weren't in a rush, but they're just making plays that they needed to. They're running the ball. They're picking up 4 to 5 yards on first down. Just little like short passes, honestly, and that's what allowed them to win this game, in my opinion. They did just enough to win. Obviously, they kick a game-winning field goal with 3 seconds left to go there. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really worried about this Florida State team. I understand it's week 0. Not everyone has played yet, but just based on what I've seen from week 1, for a team that has playoff expectations, against a team that I personally don't think will end the year in the top 25 in Georgia Tech, it was scary for me. I don't think Georgia Tech is a team that I now think is going to be in the top 15, in the top 20, making a lot of noise. I think that they're going to be, a 6 to 8 win team at best. And they just came to play this game. They brought good energy. Their defensive line stepped up after Florida State ran it down their throat in the first quarter. And so I wasn't really impressed, honestly, by both teams. But I think they did enough to win, and it made for a great game, especially to open the year. That's exactly what you want to see. You want to see close games like that. So for a fan perspective, it was great, right? Close game, a lot of defense, just a lot of stagnated offense as well. But Georgia Tech did enough to win. I think they are fun to watch just with how how well they're able to run the ball with their quarterback. I think Haynes King, we didn't see his arm talent as nearly as enough as I think he's capable of, but I did think that he executed a lot in the run game, and he's tough, right? I mean, he's not a guy that is going to sit back in the pocket and look fancy and throw for 300 to 400 yards. He's going to be a guy that puts his nose down. He's going to fall forward on runs. He's going to look for contact and seek that out in order to do what he does to get his team in the best position to win, and ultimately he did that. So we mentioned the playoff a little bit, just about conference championships and whatnot. We saw on game day, everyone has their predictions. So I have mine. We're going to get into that. And this year, obviously different, right? It's a 12-team playoff. The top 4 highest-ranked conference champions automatically get a bye, and then you have essentially 7 at-large bids because a non-Power 5 school will send their conference champion into the playoff as well. So we're going to get into that here. I saw a lot of different predictions just on game day and seeing people online, and obviously there's a lot of ways this can go. I don't think anyone's going to be predicting it perfectly, especially now that we're at 12 teams. It's a lot harder when you're talking about conference championships automatically leading to a bid. With how large these conferences are now with realignment, it's essentially impossible to accurately predict this all the way through, but this is kind of just some thought that I've put into it, and without further ado, we're going to get into it. So at number 12, I have who I think will be the Mountain West champion this year in the Boise State Broncos. They're 20 minutes down the road from me, but I think this is a really exciting team this year. I think that, a lot of people thought Malachi Nelson was going to be getting the starter quarterback job. That was not the case, but I still think this team is extremely dangerous. When you look at Ashton Jonty and what he was able to do in the run game last year, they have full-time coach now. Last year there was a lot of concern halfway through the year is if this Boise State program is falling off. Ultimately, they're still able to win their conference and win, 8 or 9 games and have a pretty productive season. But I think the boys in blue are legit this year. I think they're going to make a lot of noise. I like their schedule a lot in the Mountain West. They have some key games at home. They do have a test at Oregon early in the year in Eugene at Autzen Stadium. And I think that game will tell us a lot about this Boise State team. I think if they hang close and they show that they can compete with these high-level teams that are going to be in the top 5 and top 10, then that will pay dividends down the road when it comes to selection time, as long as they're allowed to win their conference. And even if they don't beat Oregon, I still think as long as they show that they can be competitive, I think that's ultimately going to prove a lot to the committee and a lot to just fans around the country as well. So number 12, I have Boise State. At number 11, I have the Missouri Tigers. I think Brady Cook is due for a big season. I liked what I saw from these guys last year. I think they're riding a high. The Cotton Bowl victory against Ohio State, finally showing the nation that this is a Missouri program that can win on a big level. I like some home games that they have this year. I really went back and forth on this between Missouri and Ole Miss. I think they're two very similar teams in the sense that they've been in this position. They've been programs that have been growing for the last 3 to 4 years. And now finally they have an opportunity to prove themselves on the big stage. The reason I didn't go with Ole Miss is because I do think that they just have too many sketchy games in a row. When you look at their schedule, a lot of them being on the road as well. I believe they have Alabama on the road and they play Oklahoma as well. So just some tough games. I'm not necessarily sure that this is going to be an Ole Miss team that can win all those games and pull them out, right? We understand that they're fun to watch and they have an explosive offense, but just because you're fun to watch doesn't mean you're going to be able to win big games. And I think that's going to be the case with Ole Miss. I do think Missouri, however, is a more experienced team. I think they're poised. I really like Eli Drinkowitz and what he's been able to do with this program in terms of turning this program around from what it was. So I think Missouri is going to be a true contender, and I see them making the college football playoff this year. At number 10, I have Alabama. This is a team that is going to be going under a lot of change this year, right? Nick Saban retires, Kalen DeBoer takes over as the head coach. We see Caleb Downs transfer. A lot of changing in this program. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how they look this year. I could see them not making the playoff, but I still think that this is, a 9 to 10 win team at worst. At best, I think they're the conference champions. The SEC is super deep this year, as we'll see in this playoff rankings. I think this is a conference that can easily send anywhere from 3 to 5 teams to the college football playoff. But I think Alabama finds themselves somewhere in there. I think Jalen Milroe is a stud. I think he can get the job done with his arm and his legs. And when you look at what Kalen DeBoer has been able to do with quarterbacks, especially guys like Michael Penix Jr. the last couple years at Washington. I truly think he's going to be able to turn Jalen Milroe into a dynamic player, and I think we're going to see him take a step up with his arm talent as well. And at the end of the day, Alabama is going to be Alabama, right? So they're going to be competitive. They're going to be in big games, and I think they're going to find a way to get into this playoff this year. Number 9, I have the defending champs, Michigan Wolverines. Another program that has gone a lot of change. They lose their head coach with Jim Harbaugh going to the Chargers. And I think this is just a program that is still going to be competitive this year, similar to Alabama. Sharon Moore comes in, takes over from offensive coordinator, head coach. He has experience being the head coach of this team. We saw him win big games against Penn State and Ohio State last year. This team has championship experience despite losing a lot of guys to the draft. It looks like Alex Orji is going to get the starting job. Now, I'm not the biggest Alex Orji fan. I think that he's one of those guys where you see him come in on a lot of designed runs and just kind of quarterback design plays. I don't think that his arm is going to win this Michigan team a lot of games, but I don't think that this Michigan team necessarily needed J.J. McCarthy's arm to win a lot of games last year, right? I mean, you look at the Penn State game, they run the ball 20, 30 times in a row, whatever it was, and they're still able to come out of there with a win. And I think it's going to be the same case here this year. I think you're going to see them continue to use the ground and pound and find a way to win games. I do think they lose to Ohio State this year. I think their little streak of them getting the dub over the boys in Columbus ends this season. They have some tough games. They have Oregon at home in Ann Arbor. I think that will be a really good game that will tell us a lot about this Michigan team. But I still think they find a way. They have some tough teams with just, not big games, but mediocre, middle-of-the-pack Big Ten teams this season. I think they'll be able to take care of most of those. And as long as they do their housekeeping, they win the games they're supposed to, and they're competitive in those big games, I think they'll be just fine. Number 8, I have Utah Utes. I don't have them winning the Big 12. I decided to go a different way. We'll get to that in a minute. But this Utah team is experienced, right? I mean, you see guys talk about it all the time. Death taxes Utah football. They're always going to be in the mix. They're always going to be competitive. Kyle Whittingham, I think, is a top 10 coach in the country. I don't think he gets the recognition that he deserves from a lot of people around the country, and that's because he's been playing in the Pac-12, right? The conference that is no longer. The Pac-12 saw a lot of talent, a lot of good coaches come in and out of that conference, and I think they just kind of flew under the radar. And Kyle Whittingham is the perfect example of what he's been able to do with this Utah team. Before last season, they were the back-to-back defending champs in the conference. They knocked off USC with Caleb Williams twice in the same season, which really is the only reason USC wasn't a playoff team that year. And I honestly think this transition, right, from the Pac-12 to the Big 12 isn't going to be too much for them. I don't think the Big 12 is on the same level as conferences like the SEC and the Big 10. I do think they're better than the ACC, but in my eyes, that's not really hard to do. They do have some tough tests this year, but in my opinion, Utah is simply unbeatable at home, right? Like, I think when you see this huge team at home, they're rolling. Cam Rising's coming back for his, seems like, 12th year of college football. So with him at the helm, as long as he's able to stay healthy, I think this team is going to be competitive. They're going to be in the mix. I think they're going to be making a lot of noise. We saw them take some steps back last year after a hot start. They had some problems with the quarterback position. Obviously, Rising was hurt. He sat out all last year. So I think now that he's back, I don't know if he's going to be the same person that we saw 2 years ago, but I do think he still will be a major contributor to this team. He's going to lead them into the top 8, in my opinion. At number 7, we go back to the Big Ten with Penn State. I think Penn State finally has a window where they can get into a playoff. They're one of those teams every year where we talked about, is this Penn State's year? Can they get past Michigan? Can they get past Ohio State? And this year, I do think they get past Michigan. I'm not sure if they get past Ohio State. But now that this playoff is at 12 teams, that doesn't really matter anymore, right? I think when you look at Drew Aller last year, he's kind of a game manager. He's a true freshman coming in. Obviously, that's a big environment. That's tough to do to win those games when you're in the spotlight as a true freshman. But I think that he'll take a big leap this year. I think James Franklin will finally prove himself as a winning head coach on the big stage. We know he can take care of the games that he's supposed to, but we haven't really seen him win the big games, the Ohio States, the Michigans, games like that really decide whether you're a contender or a pretender. And I think Penn State's I think Penn State is a contender this year. I don't know if that's necessarily meaning they're going to be in the national championship game, but I think you can see them in that top 5 to 7 range. But a lot of this is going to depend on Drew Aller and just how he plays this year. I mean, we see with a lot of teams that only go as far as the quarterback takes them, and I think Aller's going to have what it takes this year. I like what I see in the running game that can support him. I think this defense is going to be strong once again. Last year, a top 10, top 15 defense in the country, but they just didn't get enough from the offense when they needed it most, and we saw those in those big games like I've talked about. But I think they take a step up this year. I like their schedule. I like the games they have at home. And I see Penn State coming in at number 7. At number 6, hook 'em. I have Texas. I think that this is a Texas team last year that finally saw what it's like to be the championship level. I think they understand what it takes. I really like Quinn Ewers. The jump from year 1 to year 2 was something that really stood out to me, and I think the jump from year 2 to year 3 is going to be just as impressive. I think as he gets older and he stays in this program under Steve Sarkisian, the more he's just able to learn in terms of reading the defense, pre-snap, what's he going to see, how's he going to get his protection lined up. And now that Texas joins the SEC, all that becomes just as important as it was before, right? Especially when you're dealing with some of these defenses that you're going to see in this conference, and all the different looks that he's going to have to deal with throughout the course of the year. They have a big game with Michigan coming up in a couple weeks. I think that will kind of show us where both teams are at. But a lot of times with these early season matchups, we really get into this hype of, if Michigan wins, right, Michigan's like, they have it done, they got it taken care of. They're better than they thought we were. Texas, maybe they're not as great. But like we saw last year when Alabama loses to Texas, both teams still get into the playoff. I think that's going to be a similar situation here. They do lose a lot of weapons to the draft last year. Adonai Mitchell takes off, is drafted by the Colts. Xavier Worthy goes to the Chiefs. But with a program as big as Texas, talent is not hard to find. I think they have a great recruiting class. I think Sark has done a great job here turning this program around into what people expect Texas to be, right? A powerhouse. You want to see them in these big games. Last year they were, a couple plays away from winning the Sugar Bowl and potentially going to the national championship game. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But I do think that Texas is for real this year. I could easily see them winning the Big 12. I just decided to have some fun and take a risk here. But I think Texas is for real this year. I have them at number 6. Number 5, I have the Mighty Ducks of Oregon. I think this Oregon team is the most complete that we've seen in recent years. Dan Lanning is an incredible coach, and what he's been able to do with this program is truly impressive, right? In past years with Oregon, with previous head coaches, Mario Cristobal, Willie Taggart, guys like that, it was never a debate on whether this team was talented. It was a debate on whether they could win the big games and be complete on both sides of the ball. And when you look at Dan Lanning, he has an emphasis on in between the trenches, the defensive line, the offensive line. He has a defensive background at Georgia. He was a national championship coach there. And he brings that winning mentality with him to Eugene. And I think that ultimately puts him in a really great position this year, where there's never been a better time to win a national championship than now for the Ducks. I think Dylan Gabriel coming in, I think he's the real deal. There are some question marks that I do have about his arm talent, his decision making, but I think he's going to be able to get the job done. He's great on his feet. Jordan James coming back into the backfield is huge for this team. And then defensively on that side of the ball, I think they're going to be outstanding. I think they're going to be one of the top defenses in the Big Ten this year. And like I mentioned, being able to play within the trenches is what will win and lose you games in the Big Ten. I think that's where they elevate from a lot of different teams here in this top 12, is in the trenches and being able to provide time for their quarterback and really get after other quarterbacks on the defensive end. And especially when you look at the transfers they have coming in, Evan Stewart, wide receiver from Texas A&M, Tez Johnson comes back for his, I believe it's his 5th year. So this is a dangerous Oregon team. I think it's going to be important to look out for them. And we could see them match up with Ohio State here in a couple weeks, and that will be a really exciting game in Eugene on the West Coast. Really the first major Big Ten matchup we have this season in a new look in the Big Ten, right? All right, we're into the top 4. These are conference champions. So if you win your conference, you're automatically in the top 4. You get the automatic qualifier, and you get the bye, which is most important, right? So at number 4, I have the Miami Hurricanes. This might be a surprise to a lot of people. This Miami team is pretty controversial. They have a lot of talent this year. I don't love what I see from the teams in their conference. We've talked about Florida State. And I feel the same way about Florida State that I do Clemson. I don't love the play that I've seen from Cade Klubnik. I think he could potentially take a step up this year, but I still don't think he's going to be the caliber quarterback of the Deshaun Watsons and Trevor Lawrences and people that we've seen come before him. But this Miami team did a lot of work in the transfer portal this year. There's never been a question about Mario Cristobal's ability to recruit talent. He gets Damian Martinez coming in from Oregon State, and then he brings in Cam Ward, who is possibly the number one targeted prospect in the portal this season, comes over from Washington State. So he really picks up probably the two best remaining players in the Pac-12, or the Pac-2, if you want to refer to it as that. So I think offensively they're going to have a lot of firepower. I think they're going to be fun to watch. And I really like their schedule. They don't really play a ton of tough opponents. They have one ranked opponent on their schedule as of now, and that's Florida State. So if you're looking for a team that can kind of just squeak by and coast through this season simply based on their talent and ability to just take care of teams that they should, then I think Miami's that squad. I do think they'll beat Florida State this season. But once again, you never know, right? This is college football, and you never know what's going to happen. We saw that yesterday, or I guess Saturday, for those watching on Monday. So I have Miami at number 4. Number 3, this will be another big surprise. We've already talked about some Big 12 teams in Utah, but I do think that Kansas State is going to come in at the number 3 spot. Avery Johnson looks like he's going to be a stud this year. I think when you look at Will Howard transferring to Ohio State, you look at it and you go, okay, this guy had a great tenure at Kansas State. Why would he want to leave and go to a bigger program besides the money, right? Obviously, Ohio State, we understand their ability to bring in talent through NIL. But I think the talent level of Avery Johnson had a lot to do with this. I think internally there was probably a lot of discussion with the coaching staff, and I think that they probably decided that this is going to be their guy going forward. He's young, he's exciting, he has a strong arm, you do it on the ground, and he's going to be backed up by a great backfield with DJ Giddens and Dylan Edwards, 2 transfer running backs that are going to come in. I think they're going to be deadly in the backfield. We saw Dylan Edwards last year at Colorado under Coach Deion Sanders, and I feel like he was a threat. Obviously, that was a Colorado team that wasn't great, but I think in the right situation, a guy like Dylan Edwards can be great in his role, and when you have a quarterback and an offense that is going to be as explosive as I think this Kansas State offense is, I think he's going to be great. And especially when you look at last year, they come off a 9-win season, so a lot of momentum coming into this year. They get Arizona and Oklahoma State at home. I think those are probably 2 of their toughest games this year, because outside of that, I think it's a pretty easy schedule in a conference that I don't think is going to be too tough to handle this year. Especially after Texas and Oklahoma are no longer around in the Big 12. I do think if it's not Kansas State, it's Texas. I touched on that earlier, Texas in the SEC now. If it's not Kansas State, it's Utah, is what I meant to say. That just shows how insane college football is now, right? Texas in the SEC, Utah comes over to the Big 12, and no one really knows what's going on, right? So I like Kansas State. I like their team this year. I think they're a sleeper pick. I think you have to mix it up. I think this is going to be a playoff that's going to surprise a lot of people, and I think Kansas State might be the biggest surprise of the season to most. At number 2, I have Ohio State. The Buckeyes this year, I think, are poised to probably win the national championship. Similar to Oregon, I think it's the best team we've seen in recent years. I was listening to Coach Urban Meyer the other day talk about what he saw from the team during their training camp this fall. And he said that this is probably the most complete team that he's seen from them in a really long time. And that's coming from a guy that won a national championship with Ohio State under Cardale Jones at the helm at quarterback. So if Urban Meyer is saying that, then you know that this team is really something special. Will Howard comes in from Kansas State. We just talked about that. And Caleb Downs, maybe the biggest recruit in the transfer portal on the defensive side of the ball, comes in from Alabama. And I think this team is dangerous. I think they could easily win the national championship. But we've seen this before, right? Ohio State comes in, a lot of talent, a lot of hype around their transfers, guys stepping up in the new roles, and they fall short, right? Last year they lose to Michigan. They miss out on the playoff. The year prior to that, same situation, right? We've seen these last 2 years where they go to Michigan or they have Michigan at home, and Michigan is able to just out-tough them, run it down their throat, get pressure on the quarterback, and really just out-physical this Ohio State team. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think they've learned their lesson from the last 2 years. I think they have a lot of motivation, And I understand a lot of people saying Ryan Day, if he doesn't win this year, that he should be out at Ohio State. I couldn't disagree more. I think Ryan Day's a great coach. I think his ability to utilize his resources, whether it's NIL or the transfer portal, to build the best team possible is pretty unmatched. And so if it's not Ryan Day, then who is it, right? Like, yes, a lot of coaches are going to want the Ohio State job, but if you're going 11-1 and 10-2, I understand it's Ohio State, right? But this is a team that I think is complete with Ryan Day. I think he does a great job. I think they have a real chance to win the national championship this season. So don't be surprised if the Buckeyes take the crown after this year. Now, number one, we all know who's left. Georgia. I think this is a Georgia team that is fired up after last year, not making the playoff after going undefeated and then losing to Alabama in the SEC championship game. Carson Beck comes back, top-level recruiting class. These guys are just poised for a big run. I think that you're going to see a lot of angry football from Georgia this year. And I think their schedule is harder than they've had in years past, right? When you look at the last 2 years, they haven't really had to play Alabama. They haven't had to play a lot of these tougher SEC teams. Yes, they've played the Ole Misses and the Tennessees, teams that have been good, but maybe not on the same level as Georgia. This year they'll get a shot against a few of those teams, right? So I think it's really going to be interesting. They have a preseason game against Clemson. That will tell us a lot about them as well. I do think they take care of business against Clemson handedly. I think we're going to see pretty early on this year that the ACC is pretty weak. I've talked about that more than enough this episode. So I think Georgia, I have them coming in at number one. I think whoever the SEC champ is going to get the number one seed simply based on how tough the conference is. And whoever wins that conference is going to be probably the favorite to win the national championship just based on the battles that they're going to have to endure. I mean, if it's Georgia, you're looking at Bama, you're looking at Ole Miss, you're looking at Texas, you're looking at Clemson. If it's Alabama, you're looking at Texas once again. You're looking at a number of teams in the SEC. And that's the thing with conference realignment, right, is whoever comes out of these conference, they're going to be battle tested. They're going to be ready to compete for national championship. I think the days of worrying about strength of schedule are over. I think that you're not going to have to worry about, scheduling a tough preseason game in week 0 or week 1 when you know you're going to have 4 ranked teams in a 6-week stretch to end your season. And that goes for everyone. That goes for the SEC. It goes for the Big Ten. I think we could see some Big 12 teams sneak up this year into the 10 to 18 ranked range. I think that's probably where they top out. And who knows? Maybe the ACC surprises a lot of people this year, and they can run the table. But that's my top 12 for you guys. That's what I got. It's not going to be perfect, but it will be something fun that we can revisit at the end of the season. So before we get out of here, we're going to end it with some track and field, right? We talked about the Olympics last year. For those who don't follow track and field closely, there are still professional meets going on in the Diamond League, which is the only professional circuit really around for pro track and field athletes. There will be changes to that coming soon. We're going to get into that. But this is just something that I've been noticing in the last week or two, watching these Diamond League meets, that is pretty interesting, and it's something that I was thinking about today. And that's that as fans and as someone who participates in the sport, I'm a fan of the sport. You want to see the best of the best compete, as much as you can. In basketball and football and baseball, you always want to see, KD and LeBron going at it. You want to see the ace pitcher going against, the Yankees, just trying to pull out. You just want to see a great game, no matter what. You want to see the faces of each sport face off. And unfortunately, in track, we rarely see that unless it's the World Championships or the Olympics, right? I think the prime example of that is Sydney McLaughlin. She's a stud. She's well-known. She's the face of the sport, you could argue. And really the only time we see her is at the Olympic trials and the World Championships or the Olympics, if it's an Olympic year, right? She's the world record holder. She could probably win the 400 and the 400-meter hurdles year in, year out if she wanted to. She's that talented. But we only really see her compete 3 to 4 times a year. And as fans, as much as we love Sydney, it's disappointing because we want to see her break the records, right? We want to see her get sub 50 in the hurdles. We want to see her going double in the 400. We want to see more face-offs against Femke Bowl. And unfortunately, we just don't get that based off the fact that a lot of athletes aren't getting the compensation that they deserve, so they're not getting paid enough, therefore meaning they're not going to go risk their bodies an extra 5 to 6 times a year just so that fans are satisfied, right? Now, in a different situation, you look at a Thing Mo. She was a favorite in the 800. She's the American record holder, and she probably was one of the favorites coming into the Olympics to win the 800 meters. Unfortunately, she falls in the final at the Olympic trials in Eugene. Had the opportunity to be there and watch it, and you just kind of feel the whole air out of the stadium is just gone as soon as she falls, right? She was immediately out of the race. There was no coming back for her. And I think a part of that, not necessarily the whole reason, because I do think a lot of times in those races it's just unfortunate circumstances. But if a Thing Mo had raced more in the season, she probably has more experience just in terms of knowing where to position herself, knowing that maybe standing in the back of a pack with 5 to 6 people in a final isn't a great idea just because of the risk that you could fall. Now, I understand she's a professional runner. She knows how to run an 800 meter, obviously. But if there's a way for you to practice your craft so that when you get to the big moments, you can learn more, then I think you have to take advantage of that. Now, for those who don't know, a Thing Mo didn't run in any meet, any competitive meet until the Olympic trials. Now, I think if she would have made it, I think she would have had a chance to compete at the Olympics. But you just never know, right? And if you're not competing and you're not testing your body somewhat frequently, then it's hard to just flip that switch and turn it on. And unfortunately, we see that a lot with track athletes, right? And so as fans, you want to see these big face-offs. You want to see Noah Lyles versus Let's Tobogo. You want to see Jakob Ingebrigtsen and Josh Kerr go at it. Shout out to Jakob, by the way. He breaks the 3K record today at the Diamond League meet. And no complaints from me about him in terms of his ability to be active at meets. He's always running, always testing himself, which as a fan, you might not love the ego, but you have to appreciate the fact that he's always ready to show up and compete, right? So as a fan, we know we want to see athletes compete, but it's not necessarily the athlete's fault, right? Like I said earlier, looking at finances and putting your body at risk, it doesn't make a ton of sense when you look at the whole situation. So for high-end athletes, if you're Sydney McLaughlin, if you're Noah Lyles, and it's an Olympic year, why would you go travel the world and participate in 3 to 4 meets and max out your body an extra 3 to 4 times in a year where you're going to have to use every ounce to be able to produce at the Olympics? Why would you go and travel the world and use more energy, right? Well, when there's no money coming in for these athletes, it makes no sense for them to go travel. A lot of athletes that we see in the Diamond League are names that if you're a true fan of the sport that you probably recognize, but the real reason they're there a lot is to probably work on their craft, but a lot of them are running for sponsorships, running for brand deals, just because they need that money and exposure to be able to stay in this sport. Track is a sport that is heavily dependent on brand deals and sponsorships, whether it's shoes or watches or gear or whatever it might be, right? And so if you're running for that, you're risking and losing your own money, banking on the fact that you're going to be able to produce enough at a high level on the track that these brands will finally look at you and you can make a money off of your own name. I think the perfect example of this is Grant Holloway, right? He wins the 110 meter hurdles at the Olympics in Paris, immediately goes to his press conference and talks about how he wants a watch deal. There's no reason that an Olympic champion should be going to do a press conference and the first thing he's talking about is how he doesn't have a brand deal and how he needs more money or how he wants more money. Now, I understand that there are people that are like, oh, boo-hoo, he won $50,000, right? But in terms of professional athletics, for the prize money for a gold medal to only be $50,000 when we have NBA players and NFL players who are signing $25 million signing bonuses, it's ridiculous. And, I don't think it's really anyone's fault except for the people that overlooked the track as a whole. I think that there's a lot of executives and CEOs that have failed to put their best athletes in the spotlight. But I do think it's a balance. I think athletes have to be willing to compete, and I think these higher-ups and suits have to be willing to put athletes in a position to compete at a high level and be enticed enough to know that they can go put their body on the line, compete at a high level, and still be able to make a profit and have the whole experience be worth it, right? Athletes aren't going to go lose money and put their body at risk when they could stay in training and work even harder just to produce on the big stage. But finally, I think we found the answer for that, and that is Grand Slam track. Grand Slam track has been started by Michael Johnson, for those who haven't heard it. Maybe one of the greatest sprinters in USA history. Well, maybe. He is certainly one of the greatest track and field athletes in the history of the sport. He starts this event called Grand Slam track. Now, many of you are probably asking, what's Grand Slam? What's that about? Let me break it down for you. It's going to be 4 major meets a year, similar to tennis where you have your 4 majors. These meets are going to have larger prize money and bonuses for winning and placement. We've already seen athletes like Sydney McLaughlin sign to Grand Slam track to participate in these meets, and it's an opportunity to pay them their worth, right? When you see these high-end athletes that we see in the Olympics and the World Championships year in, year out, this is finally an opportunity for them to run for something that's worth their time, right? I've talked about it. They're not going to go travel and run in Switzerland when the prize money is $15,000, and so that's your top end, right? At the best, you're going to win 15 grand. At the worst, you could, lose and hurt yourself and risk an injury. Now, obviously, that's excessive, but that's what these athletes have to deal with, right, when they're making these decisions. But Grand Slam track allows them an opportunity to be on a set schedule. They have 4 major meets that are spread out throughout the year, and I think the prize money mixed in with the sponsorship opportunities is really going to allow these athletes to be more enticed to participate more throughout the year, which ultimately leads to more exposure, which leads to more fans being involved in the sport, and that ultimately brings more money, right? And unfortunately, that's what sports are all about, especially in this day and age. But, it's similar to the WNBA, I would like to think, where the more promotion and the more money that goes into it, the more money that's going to be available for the athlete. We've seen this a lot. As soon as we see Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese get drafted into the WNBA, it immediately turns more eyes lead to profit leads to more money for the athletes. It's the same thing with track. You have to be able to expose your brand. You have to be able to reach out to people who turn on the TV and watch the 100-meter dash, the 100-meter dash every 4 years, right? You want them to be watching it every 1 to 2 months, whether it's Kenny Bednark and Noah Lyles lining up, if it's Kashane Thompson and Fred Curley going at it. You want to see these guys compete regularly, right? No one wants to watch, LeBron James and Steph Curry play once every 3 years. You want to see them play, on a nightly basis. So I think Grand Slam track is finally a solution to this. I hope it works out, especially as a track and field fan. It's really cool to see how invested people get into the sport as soon as it's on a big stage. So why would we not try and provide a consistently big stage that will allow these athletes to compete on a bigger level? It's worth their time. They get the money, the exposure. And for a sport that seems to be pretty well respected and well enjoyed by people all over the world. It's not just America. You see it a lot in Europe as well. And so I think being able to bring more exposure to the sport is a great idea. I'm super excited about it, especially as someone who runs track and field. So shout out Michael Johnson for being able to start something and really take an initiative to a sport that, although it's enjoyable, it really is a lot of times struggling in terms of being able to produce money for their athletes that do so much for the sport. That's going to wrap it up here for episode 2 of Chop It Up Sports. Be sure to go follow on Instagram, TikTok, go subscribe to the YouTube, check us out. We're going to be hopefully providing weekly, maybe bi-weekly, kind of just depends on the schedule. But be sure to stay in touch with you guys, comment on this video, give us ideas on your thoughts on what I had to say. Maybe you have a different team in the college football playoff. Maybe you have your own thoughts on athletes not competing a lot in track and field. Whatever it may be, just give your thoughts. Be sure to reach out. And that's going to be it for episode 2. Thanks for listening, and catch you guys on the next one.